oftentimes when something is colorful, it's thought of as cheap and cheerful. And I really want to flip that on its head because color brings us so much joy. And I don't think we should deny ourselves. And this is kind of the thesis of Joyful, is that we have this one life. It's very short. Maybe living life to its fullest is embracing the things that bring us joy every day.
For too long, we've been led to believe that only two types of people can have an extraordinary creative career: creative genius and people who hustle so hard that they're working all the time. Here on the Everyday Talent Podcast, we are shattering that myth. This podcast is built on one truth, which is every one of us can have an extraordinary creative career. The way to get there is not by sacrificing all of ourselves to our work, but rather embracing our authentic selves and carve out unique paths to a fulfilling and joyful creative life. Hello and welcome. My name is Betty. I'm a creative and a coach for creators. I've coached photographers, filmmakers, visual artists, arts consultants, and arts leaders to make intentional career shifts and build thriving independent practices. This podcast is for you if you're looking to cut through the noise of what you should be doing in your creative career and figure out what actually works and matters for you. Before we begin, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your platform of choice. Leave us a rating and review and share this podcast on your social so that more amazing creatives out there can find out about this podcast and feel seen. So welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Talent Podcast. Today I have a very special guest here with me, Sasha. Welcome to the podcast, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Betty. It's such an honor to be here.
Sasha, can you tell me or tell the audience a little bit what you do and introduce your amazing brand to us?
Thanks, Betty. So my name is Sasha, and I'm the founder of SteMargScot, which is a colorful outerwear brand that is made in Canada and specifically made in Toronto. Our goal was to reimagine what warmth could look like if it didn't require synthetics, plastics, or metals. And I think we really are aiming at two things: to make people feel great in the winter with color and to produce coats that are sustainable and renewable and circular. And so that's just a bit about my company called SteMargScott.
Awesome. Before we dive further into the story of SteMargScott and what it represents, I have so many questions. I want to start with you. How did you come to found this brand? And as I know, this is almost like a second or third career. Tell us a bit more about your career trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really long story. And interestingly enough, I did your creative quiz. And I loved the one question that said, do you have a hard time describing what you do to people? Because that is the story of my life. Because when someone asks me, I say, well, how much time do you have? It's a long story. I think one of the things that you have to know about me is my story is a very typical immigrant story. So my mom and I came to Canada when I was 6 years old. And that immigrant mentality of having to work really hard and choosing a really academic career with a stable income so that you could break that cycle of struggle that your ancestors had. That was something that was important to me. And growing up, I loved things that were creative. I loved art and making things from garbage and anything. But when it came to choosing a career, I knew that I had to pick something that was a bit more quote unquote serious. So I also had a real passion for science. And so I decided, okay, this is great. Let me go into the sciences, and it is a sincere passion. Like, I could watch the nature of things all day long.
Hey.
I'm a big nerd in that way. And so I started my career teaching science, so science, biology, chemistry at the secondary level. And then I did that for a number of years and really enjoyed it. But I always have this itch to learn and grow. And so then I went on to do my master's, and I did that through Sick Kids in drug discovery with a real focus on biochemistry. And I thought initially I'd do my master's and then bring that back to my students so that I could be a better teacher for them. But of course, I ended up falling in love with that as well. So I did both
Yes.
careers at the same time, which was really crazy because my schedule would look like get to the lab at 6 a.m., do experiments from 6 to 9 a.m., then go to my school, teach 2 classes, and then go pick up my kids from school. So, as you can
Wow.
imagine, that's not really sustainable. And then I switched to maybe I teach for a semester and then I work in the lab for a semester. So I did that also for some time, and then COVID hit.
Mm.
And as is typical with many people, during COVID, we had a lot of time to think and reflect. And, in a conversation with my partner one day, I was just thinking about other passions that I have in my life, which is fashion, art, nature, in addition to science. And I thought at the end of my life, would I have any regrets? And
Mm.
I thought, well, I've already checked off so many of the things that I wanted to do in my life. And so maybe this would be an opportunity to start something new and delve into something that I never thought was really an option for me.
Mm.
And I think it's only after giving my all to teaching and my research that I felt like I could delve into that creativity. I felt like I almost earned that chance. And so then on conversation with my partner, he said, "What would you do if you could do anything and money wasn't really an issue and stability wasn't really an issue?" And I said, "Make colorful wool coats." And it was like such a random and specific
When it
answer.
was specific, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, but it's just something that I love color, as you can probably tell. And for me, I love a great coat. Like I really believe in like finding that dream coat.
Very suitable for the Toronto weather.
Yeah, exactly. Like a coat is essential for survival. And
Hmm.
so I always had dreamed about finding that coat that just makes you feel great. And so it all kind of came together in that way. There's another backstory. It had been on my mind for a while, several years back, where I kind of had the realization that if you're willing to spend a certain amount of money on a coat and you go to the store, there's just a handful of options, and they kind of all look the same and they're all kind of made of the same materials. And I wondered why that was and why it was so hard to find something different. So that had always been on my mind as well.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So many things I resonated in our questions with what you shared there, Shasha. And first of all, let me thank you for like being candid that immigrant mentality, and that a lot of us, like one thing that I hear when as I was grew up as an immigrant, it's like, oh, our parents didn't take us here to for us to suffer. So as such, like that pursuit of like a stable or professionalized job, it's become such a entrenched norm in the like second generation immigrant mentality. And so I really resonate with that. But the other thing that also strike me is that like it's one thing to say someone have multiple passion, like you've been able to kind of like, oh, I am interested in that, let me test that interest and then actually like follow through and do it. So I'm curious, what is your secret sauce almost of like being able to follow your heart and your interest?
Yeah, I honestly I think I love a really good challenge. Even in my research, so what I studied was drug discovery. So my research focused on finding a drug for an incurable disease, which to me seems like an insurmountable task for anyone. It's something that, you just put everything you have into it and it's all you think about day and night. And those were some of the hardest days of my life. I don't think I've worked as hard as I did during those days, but I did it. And we published a paper in I think the top gastroenterology journal. And then I won an award for that. So that was a huge
Mm.
accomplishment. And doing things like that, I think, gives you a little bit of boost of confidence that if you try, a lot is possible. I don't know if everything is possible or anything is possible, but certainly you can take a good stab at it. I think for me, I have this thing about integrity as well. If I say I'm going to do something, I hold myself to that. And so I really do try to give it my all. I really believe, I think in Glennon Doyle's book, Untamed, she's one of my favorite authors. And I love that book, but she says we can do hard things. And that's something that I always think about. It's that growth mindset that we can do hard things. So I think that all of those things kind of resonate with me. And that's what keeps me going through
Yeah.
all of these different career paths.
One thing I heard there is that like the scientist curiosity mindset has really supported you, not just within the scientific realm. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I'm thinking at the backdrop that we sometimes have this dichotomy between the scientist or math person versus the artist, especially in the Western media portrayal.
Mhm.
And I certainly don't resonate with that. I grew up as a math nerd. And so, like, can you tell us how you like learn from each of these like science and now fashion design? Like, how those like things having different like facets of your brain and how they support each other and maybe sometimes at odds with each other?
Yeah, it's that's a great question. I honestly believe that they do support each other. A lot of the experiments that I came up with, so in research, like you were doing something for the first time ever. You were investigating something for the first time, and no one else in the world has ever done that experiment on that system. And so you really have to think outside of the box and be creative. And I have I remember dreaming about some experiments and even sitting and daydreaming about experiments that I could do to test my model. And I think it's the same creative process with design. You are exploring, you're letting your mind wander, and somehow the truth comes out, or some way or path comes
Yes.
out of all of that. And I think for both of the those careers, like being a creative and also being a scientist, you have to be disciplined to follow through with anything and focus, which is not easy. You can have lots of ideas, but to then focus in on one and figure out the path forward is, I think, maybe it's a mindset, but I think it's important in both of those careers.
For both of them, there's a level of creativity involved, and for both of them, there's a level of like having a process and trust the process to follow through involved.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
definitely.
love that. So let's like zoom in SteMargScott and tell us a bit more about the origin story. Let's start with the name. Where did the name of the brand come from?
So, when I was thinking about how I'm going to make this dream coat, I thought to myself, we have to go back to first principles and the idea of what did we do before certain very popular brands that have dominated the outerwear market? And how did we survive before those coats? So it's going back to what were the materials that we wore hundreds of years ago, and how do we make those materials hip and cool again? And how do we use as few materials as possible? I had read something once that one of these coats, one of these parkas that a lot of Canadians have, requires something like 300 parts to make. And I just thought, oh, that doesn't sound sustainable. So, how do you make a coat that's warm and stylish and makes people feel great, but requires as minimal parts as possible and is circular and honors the earth? And so it was really daunting, especially not having any background in fashion or business. And I thought to myself, maybe I need a miracle, like a fashion miracle. And I'm like, okay, just for fun, is there a
Yeah.
patron saint of fashion? Because I know there's a patron saint of lost things. So, like, if you lose something, you can pray to Saint Anthony, and maybe that lost item will appear. So I'm like, maybe there's a patron saint of fashion who can help me. I can say a little prayer to get here.
I
And I
love
did
that.
some research. Yeah. And I think, of course, there's no patron saint of fashion, but the closest person was St. Margaret of Scotland. And she is an 11th century queen consort of King Malcolm III. And the story goes is that she arrived on the shores of Scotland and she looked around, and of course, things were dark and dreary because it was the 11th century. And she thought to herself, we need to dress the people in brighter colors because this will increase the sense of joy and pride among the Scottish people. And to me, that was really powerful because she understood the power of color and the power of fashion to transform people on a deeper level really early on before Vogue. And she was also a devout person. She would wash the feet of the poor, and she was very thoughtful, and she was canonized as a saint. So I think I was really inspired by the idea of her belief in fashion. And so the company is SteMargScott is the abbreviation of St. Margaret of Scotland. So I call her our unofficial patron saint of fashion.
I love that that story has like a real like arc and rationale, and at the same time has a like dosage of like magic dust to it. So it's great. And so like what I hear the the principle or the values of the brand is that like that our like to wear fashion like our coat does not just need to be survival. It can be inspiring creativity, and there's a aspect of colorfulness, and which I would know is related to enhancing our mood and mental health. Tell us a bit about your thought process behind the material, the color, and the style.
Yeah, I really think our coats should do way more than just keep us warm. They should if we think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very top of that pyramid or triangle, which is self-actualization. A lot of us now are at the point where we're looking for things to be multifunctional, for them to have multiple purposes. And the science behind color and its effect on our moods is undeniable. We look at children's hospitals and activewear, and they're always colorful. Running shoes tend to be colorful because those are things that are energizing, and we need to look at them and feel inspired. Um, children, anything with children are oftentimes colorful because children are the
Hmm.
essence of joy and happiness. And I just looked at our what we wear as outerwear by and large in Canada, and it's all very neutral and safe. And I never understood why, in the darkest time of the year, we're wrapping ourselves in really dark
Really
colors
dark.
and inspiring colors. And oftentimes, if people look in their closets, they generally have more than one dark coat. So it's not for a lack of having that neutral. It's kind of a repetitive thing that we keep falling into. And I really think we need to give ourselves permission to feel that joy and wear the colors that we love unapologetically. I was really inspired by a book called Joyful. The author is Ingrid Fetell-Lee, and she writes about the idea of why we steer away from color. Historically, color has been associated with like Eastern cultures or savage cultures, and Western cultures tend to be more neutral. And if you think to this quiet luxury trend, very creams and
Right.
beiges, and and if you're serious, you are neutral. And if you are juvenile or silly,
Oh,
you are very
I can see
colorful.
that now. Yeah,
And so for me, I think that is a really limiting mindset.
absolutely. Hmm.
And oftentimes when something is colorful, it's thought of as cheap and cheerful. And I really want to flip that on its head because color brings us so much joy. And I don't think we should deny ourselves. And this is kind of the thesis of Joyful, is that we have this one life. It's very short. Maybe living life to its fullest is embracing the things that bring us joy every day.
Yes. Wow, I I feel like my brain just got cracked open and the light bulb come out. Like there is this like uh assumption or association, but we don't talk about it. Like whenever I see like especially in Canada because I came from Asia, I don't think that the association there is as like tight. But when I think about like the luxury or like something that's like professional, it's always like the palette that like is a little bit muted. But whereas like in other cultures, you got like bright color. Like I recently interviewed someone with a Mexican descent, and her work always has like huge bright color. And so I know some parts of Asia also love using like bright color. And so there's a narrative that's just, like very culturally specific that kind of keeps us in our place with the color choice that we use. I find it fascinating.
It's really fascinating. And then to even add a little bit more depth and complexity to that, only the royals, if you think back to that vibrant purple, only the royals could, apparently, that purple pigment comes from a mollusk. And it's to get like a small amount of that purple dye, you needed like 10,000 mollusks. And so only certain people could wear very bright colors.
Certain color.
Um, right? But everyone else besides that one person, that monarch, they were kind of the neutral group. So it is so complex and political almost.
Yes.
Yeah, it to me all of that is fascinating. The other thing that's fascinating is Ingrid Fetell-Lee from Joyful. She cited this one study that said we are kind of duped into this false sense of security when we choose things that are neutral because we think, oh, it'll never offend us. It'll be a
Right.
safe choice. But in the study, they found that if someone were to, let's say they're picking a side table for their home, and there's like a black one or their favorite color, let's say it's bright green, and they choose the bright green one, it showed that over time people still love that color. And every time they see that bright green table, it brings them a little bit of joy. Whereas the black table, the neutral one, it's safe and it'll never offend you and it's risk free, but it also gets boring over time. And so you're
Totally.
looking to replace it with something else. And it's counterintuitive because you think, oh, well, that's the safe choice. That'll be the one that I keep forever. And it's not always the case.
Yeah. It's the one that like kind of spark us a little bit every time we look at it, that we have a special connection. I totally see that. So how has it been running your fashion business, and somewhat like because I'm assuming that there's a huge aspect of being a solopreneur here, because you're involved in every process of the brand, and to transition to that from teacher, researcher, how has that been? What has been some of the rewarding aspect, and some what are the challenging aspect?
Yeah, I mean, the reward is very clear. It's the idea of seeing something that you imagined become real. The reward is seeing people get excited about a coat. One of my customers, she actually started like jumping around and smiling, almost squealing because she was so happy when she put on the coat and she really loved
Oh.
the way she looked. So for me,
Mm-hmm.
that is the idea, that was the goal, to make people feel alive and seen with these colorful coats. The challenges are very, there are so many. Where do I begin? It's time management, it's balance. There's not enough hours in the day. I wish I could clone myself. And really I think it is having to create everything. You are creating every opportunity that comes your way. And so if you have an event, you have to think of, okay, what do I have to do to prepare that event? What do I have to do during that event and following up? And it is just a lot of management. I have a small team who I'm extremely grateful for, and they are wonderful. But I think at the end of the day, it all stops at you. And so you have to approve everything. And I think that is,
Right.
it's very similar to teaching and in research. You are kind of the one paddling down that river, steering your own direction. And it's similar here. I think finding a team or developing a team that knows what's going on is the goal. Um, when you're a new company, you're still building and figuring things out on the spot. And so my team that I have now is fantastic, but I think the problem is we're still all learning. So it's not turnkey yet.
You are like kind of learning as you go, and you're leading a team, small team, to learn as it goes as well. Yeah. And how do you set success benchmark for yourself and for the brand then? What would success look like for a new company or a new brand such as this?
That's a great question. I think for us, we would love to be known as that colorful coat company. Like if someone brand recognition, someone says, "Oh yeah, I don't." Maybe they don't know SteMargScot, but they say, "Oh yeah, I know those coats. I've seen them before. That's that really colorful company." So that would be one measure of success. We have quantitative measures of success, like
Of
increase
course.
our sales by this much, reduce our cost by this much. But we're fairly new. We just launched officially in January this year, so it's,
Yay!
we haven't
Yeah.
had a full cycle yet, but we can already see that there's been more traction. So that's positive. And the brand just got nominated for a CAFA award, which was quite a yeah.
Congratulations! Yeah.
So emerging talent. So that is also really awesome, having that tiny little bit of recognition as a nomination. And so yeah, I think the other piece which I didn't talk about but is on the backs, like it's one of my big goals, is to one day make these coats using Canadian wool. So right now the coats are made in Canada, but we're using British wool. And Canada has close to 1 million sheep, and our sheep farmers or our fiber farmers, it's a struggling industry. And sheep and wool have been around for 10,000 years. They're one of the first domesticated animals, and I just think, in this race to find things that are cheaper and faster, we've lost sight of this remarkable fiber. And so I'm working now with the
Indeed.
Canadian Wool Council to find some type of supply chain where we can use Canadian wool, because Canadian wool is actually quite lovely and adapted to Canadian winters.
Mhm.
So it's actually the perfect fiber for our coats.
Oh,
And so that is also a goal of mine. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that maybe next year that we'll be able to hit that target.
well, next year when we listen to the
We'll
podcast
hope.
again,
Yeah.
that might be a goal that's achieved. I love that. Beautiful. And how about for yourself? And like, how would you know that this is something that you want to continue doing and growing? And I ask that because you have like transition, like as parallel universes. I'm also a parallel universe type. Like sometimes we need to really do the inner work to know that, like, oh, this is something that I'm doubling down on, and that's the like, and then there are other things that I'm always continuously exploring. So for you, what are like those like what would keep you going into exploring this fashion, like, oh, fashion brand business?
Yeah, it's a good question that I'm not even sure I have the answer to. Before we got on the call, I mentioned that I have my research and I have my teaching. And I think my research, I had to say, okay, I don't think I can do this, take that position off the table. My teaching position is still on hold. So I could potentially resume that. And part of me, every now and then, because to be honest, I love teaching. It didn't shift gears because I didn't like it. I shifted gears because I still wanted to continue to learn and grow. So there, teaching and working with students is very fulfilling. Like you feel like you're really impacting these students in a really great way. So you feel it. It doesn't feel like a job, and so that is still an option that I'm thinking about, whether or not I would go back to teaching maybe part time and continue the business. But in terms of continuing it long term, I think it would have to be hitting those objective targets,
Mm,
seeing the business in terms of its numbers
yeah.
going in the right direction. I think that would have to be there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you just articulated beautifully the good problem that the people multi-passionate have is that often we jump to a new thing not because we hated the old thing, but we
Hmm.
just adding links because you're like, oh, and I'm interested in this, and I see the connections that other people don't see, and I yeah, thank you for being honest with that question.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of it is why not. Like I'm always like, yes, why not? Let's add it. Let's do it. Let's try it. And I think it's you hear a lot about being a yes person, and I think I'm definitely a yes person, but sometimes it's you're so curious and you're like, let me try it. But then you realize, oh boy, I'm running out of time. There's not enough.
Mhm.
There's not enough of me to go around.
There's a management of like small yeses and big yes. Like you've said some big yes in terms of like following like your passion and explore new links. So and
Mhm.
so I'm hearing that you're like kind of figuring out the small yeses and no in your day to day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey. Oh, thank you so much, Shasha, for this wonderful interview. And if people were to want to connect with you or want to find SteMargScott or curious to buy a coat, where do they find you?
We really connect with our customers on our Instagram channel. So it's St. Mark Scott. We also have this really awesome newsletter that goes out once a month. We call it the Color Collective. And it's like this cocktail of like fashion, fun, and color and sustainability. And lastly, our website, stmargscott.com.
Awesome. We'll include all of that in the show notes. Thank you again for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
If you like what you heard today, please continue to subscribe and follow our podcast on any podcast platform of your choice or follow us on the YouTube channel. Also, please share this podcast with your creative friends. We all know how important it is to get inspiration and find resonance on our creative path. So, this podcast is really to hold space for us to have more of this kind of conversation so that we can support and uplift each other. Also, my one-on-one coaching program is open. I've coached creatives of all kinds to grow their practice and Career with Intentionality. I have 2 one-on-one programs tailored to support either independent artists and creatives or mid-career creatives who are looking for a shift. So check out those programs on my website and book a free consultation call. May we all grow our creative practice with intentionality. I see you on the next episode.